There are four major types of non-probabilistic sampling methods, or non-probability sampling. And that's availability sampling, quota sampling, purposive sampling, and snowball sampling. So availability sampling is just like what it sounds like. It's people are selected, elements are selected because they're available or they're easy to find. And so this is also known as haphazard sampling, accidental sampling, or most commonly convenient sampling. So often this happens, I have a picture of one of the prisons in Canada there, just because often this happens in prison sampling because it may depend on, A, what prison is going to cooperate with you and allow access, and then also even within the prison, I mean, there are certain offenders you might not get access to, or there are certain ones that may not even be allowed to be in your sample kind of situation. So availability sampling is basically when you're saying, well, I'm going to take whoever I can get. I just want somebody, I just want, a certain type of offender sample, and I'm going to get whatever I can get access to. And so it's literally what it sounds like. It's just by convenience based on who's available. So definitely sort of when we compare this to the idea of probabilistic sampling methods, you can see how it's very different, and you don't have that probability anymore because you don't know. It's just whoever I get access to. Another sort of good example of availability sampling is if you have people literally, stopping you in a mall while you're walking by. That's availability sampling. It's just they go to whatever mall is closest to them, and they just stop whatever people happen to be walking by, and they'll talk to whoever is willing to actually talk to them. And so that's availability or convenience sampling. Then there's quota sampling, and quota sampling is where elements are selected to make sure the sample represents certain characteristics that in proportion to the prevalence in the population. So it's kind of like the stratified random sampling, except you don't have that randomness element. But it's kind of that same idea where you have some characteristic where you want it to look a certain way in your sample, and it's to represent the larger population that you're trying to talk about. And so then you're literally filling quotas, which is why it's called quota sampling. And it is similar to stratified random sampling, but you don't have that rigor, you don't have that precision in terms of the selection procedures. And it is going to be then representative of whatever characteristics define the quotas. You don't actually know if it's representative of anything else. And often it's not much better than availability sampling because it would still be whatever is easiest to fill those quotas. And also sometimes it can be difficult because the proportion of the population might not be truly known. Often it's just like an educated guess. And so like, here's what we think the population kind of looks like, based on, whatever research that is available, or based on what we've been told. But often you don't actually, because you don't have a sampling frame if you're doing any non-probabilistic sampling. So if you're doing quota sampling, you're literally just trying to fill quotas based on what you think the population looks like for that one particular characteristic. So going back to sort of that mall example, if you're standing there with a clipboard trying to get people to fill a survey in a mall, that's availability sampling. But if you're like, oh, well, I want to make sure I ask an even number of like males and females or something like that, so then like you want to make sure that your sample is going to be as representative of the population, which you're thinking it's about 50-50 in terms of people who identify as male versus people who identify as female. So let's try to make ours about 50-50. That would be quota sampling. Or if, for example, you're asking sexual assault victims about their experience and you want a proportional representation of male and female victims, because male victims are often very more difficult to get and to get access to. So you're going to have less male victims in your sample because the vast majority of sexual assault victims are female, but you want to make sure that you get a certain proportion of males so that you're not having all female victims, because there are a small number of male victims. So you want to make sure that you're going to fill that quota and get at least a certain number of male victims in your sample. So quota sampling is literally basically it's availability sampling, but at least making sure one characteristic is what it should look like to be proportionate to the population. So then we have purposive sampling, and purposive sampling is literally where each person who ends up in your sample is selected for a purpose. And typically it's because of some unique position that they have. And so there's some targeted group that you're trying to get to be in your sample. And so usually the entire sampling group ends up being some targeted group. So like maybe you're specifically trying to get juvenile offenders, or specifically sex offenders, or specifically domestic violence victims, or there's some sort of reason why you're trying to pick individuals because they have some key characteristic that you're trying to intentionally sample. Although we don't have that randomness element still. So informants then that end up in your sample, you want people that are going to be knowledgeable about whatever it is, that thing that you're studying, which might be because, like, if you're, for example, if you're choosing sex offenders, well, it's because they are knowledgeable about sex offending because they have committed sex crimes. That would be a certain type of knowledge or experience that you're trying to get into your sample. They also have to be, of course, willing to participate. That's true of any study. And you want to make sure that they're representative of a range of points of view as well. So, for example, if we're looking at juvenile offenders, then yeah, you're going to purposely select people to be in your sample because they're juvenile offenders and they have that knowledge about juvenile offending. But maybe you want to make sure that you have a representative sample in terms of like, well, we want to make sure, we have people juvenile offenders who have been in the system for like quite a while, even though they're still juvenile offenders, and ones who are like have just entered the system. Maybe we want like a range of views about how they feel about like police, if we're asking about that, or whatever. So you want to make sure you have a range of points of view. So again, each individual is going to be purposely selected because of their group, their membership in that group of juvenile offenders, but they also might be purposefully selected because of their certain, points of view on various topics. So each element is going to be selected for a reason or for a purpose. And so typically then in a purpose of sampling kind of situation, you want to conduct the study and sort of keep getting people into your sample until what we call saturation occurs. And saturation is basically completeness. It means that when you're getting more people in your sample, they're basically repeating information and nothing new is really being added as more people are brought into your sample. So if we're, say, looking at gang activity and you're bringing in people from different types of gangs and they're being purposefully selected because they are gang members, and then you're bringing people in and you're basically like, yeah, I've like basically heard all of this before from at least one other person, maybe multiple other people, and patterns are developing, but you're not really getting new information. That would be at the point at which its saturation has happened. You are basically complete, or as complete as possible, and that would be when you stop sampling. So for purpose of sampling, you probably don't even know what your target sample number actually is. You just sort of keep going until you hit that saturation point, or until you run out of resources. So there are different types of purpose of sampling. And so stakeholder is basically, you want to purposely select people that have a vested interest. So for example, if you're testing law enforcement policies, you want to survey the police who use those policies because they're stakeholders in that. There's extreme or deviant cases, and this would be kind of purist examples. So maybe you want to test the most violently sadistic psychopaths. You're going to pick the most extreme, most deviant cases. And I have an example here of this girl who I'm sure nobody knows, but this was a woman named Kayla Bork from Simon Fraser University, where I did my graduate degrees. And she was a clear example of a psychopath where she was like torturing animals and threatening her roommate and things like that. And so that as we dug deeper into that case, she is a clear example of a psychopath. So it would be one of those, if you want an extreme or deviant case, you want a true sadistic psychopath, like those would be the kind of people you would choose. Intensity is where you basically want experiential experts. So you would ask, say, psychologists or psychiatrists about techniques for risk assessment. So you want you're intentionally choosing people who should be experts on some part of the topic that you're covering. Then sometimes you want the opposite of the extreme or deviant cases, and you want typical case. And so this is the usual, the most likely experience of, say, offenders on probation or parole. What is the most typical experience of offenders who are currently on probation or parole and how they deal with their PO or whatever. You want the most typical case, so you're going to intentionally choose the most typical case. And then we have paradigmatic cases, and this would be kind of like a category exemplar. So, for example, if we're testing something like the effectiveness of transit police, well, we would use TransLink from Vancouver as an example because they would be a category exemplar of transit police, where they have had this police force in place since the transit kind of was basically since it was created, I think. But they have like a really good system in terms of how they train their transit police and the jurisdiction and everything like that. Then sometimes you want maximum variation. And maximum variation is essentially inclusiveness. So you are intentionally choosing cases that are as far apart or as unalike as possible. And so maybe you are looking at differences in fear of crime across all possible age groups or across all possible cultural backgrounds. So you want maximum variation to then talk about fear of crime. Then sometimes there are criterion cases. So this would be if you want specific attributes. So it's not quite the same as extreme or deviant cases, but it would be something like you're specifically looking for, rapists that have psychopathic traits, or rapists that are raping for, control, or versus anger versus opportunistic, or maybe you want like a specific type, something like that. So there are specific criteria that you're sampling. And then we have what's called critical case. And critical case is a decisive case of something. So, for example, a sex offender who's been physically castrated but still commits rape. So let's look at that case, and sort of that's a critical case of showing that castration doesn't have the effect that we think it does, because people can still commit acts of sexual assault. And then something like a negative case, or also called a disconfirming case. This would be basically people who don't fit. So if we're testing a theory of low self-control, which basically says that all crime happens because people have low self-control, they can't control themselves, then let's specifically look for offenders who are most likely to demonstrate high self-control in their lives. So something like, therapists or something like that, who would seem to be, they have high levels of self-control, but for some reason they ended up committing some kind of crime. And then we have the thoughtful respondent, which basically you want a thoughtful respondent if for any of these other types that you're looking for. It's basically a good informant, somebody who is, they have the right information, they're willing to give you the information that you need, they're interested, they're useful, they're articulate in their responses, either in paper or in an interview, but this is kind of one of the most important and most used types, and typically it overlaps with any of these other types. And then we have snowball sampling. And so snowball sampling is where the elements are identified by successive informants. So it's literally you snowball your sample. And so this is really useful for hard to reach or hard to identify populations, but the members are interconnected. So there's not going to be a sampling frame, just like with any of these, but something like, for example, street level prostitutes. They are very difficult to sort of identify, or even more so if we're looking at elite level prostitutes, that's even harder to reach. But we're trying to get into this network where they know each other, but you can't just go and find them on your own unless you have an in. And so the snowball sampling is you basically have an in some way, and so you have access to one or a couple of people that you want in your sample, and then they will go and find 3 other people to be in your sample, and then each of them will find 3 other people, and so it goes like that again until you hit that saturation point where you're not getting any more information. But it literally snowballs because you're using that interconnectedness of the members to grow your sample. A problem with this is that the initial contacts may shape the entire sample and then limit access to some of those members. So if, for example, we're looking at gang members, which are another hard to reach but very interconnected group of people, if we are getting into one specific gang, then we might learn a lot about gangs that are either sort of friendly with them or within that same gang, but we're not going to get any from any of the rival gangs. So, and I mean, while that is a realistic problem that might happen, you just have to deal with it. You have to be aware of that, is that wherever your initial in was is going to shape whatever the final sample ends up being. But snowball sampling is you're literally snowballing from some in that you have with some interconnected group, and it snowballs to get you your entire sample.